From Channel 4's Eyewitness News, this is your local weather expert alert, brought to you by Egan Insurance Agency.
And good afternoon, I'm Chief Meteorologist Chris Franklin. That system that we have been talking about down in the southern Gulf for what seems like almost 2 weeks finally has a name. Well, sort of. Potential Tropical Cyclone-3. It is being designated as a potential tropical cyclone. And if you remember, it's a few years ago, the Hurricane Center decided to start using this naming scheme in order that likely we will see a more organized system to this to become a depression and then possibly a storm. But in this early developmental stage, the classification of potential tropical cyclone allows for the issuances of tropical storm watches or warnings, and we do now have tropical storm warnings from Intercoastal City all the way along the Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama coastline, all the way up to the Alabama-Florida state line. So that's the reason for this classification, because we will likely start to see impacts within the next 24 to 36 hours. So with a system so close to land, this allows for the issuance of warnings. So really nothing has changed. We just now have a track and somewhat of a center. The Hurricane Center has been reporting back from, or I should say the Air Force has reporting back to the National Hurricane Center that they're trying to find a close center of circulation, and they cannot. So what they've been looking at is just more of this broad circulation, and this is kind of where, well, it's almost a little bit more south of there, where it may be kind of a center. So it may be a center here. Looking at satellite, it may be a little bit more north. There's also been some indications that we will see within this burst of convection, thunderstorms, we may see a center try and form here. So it is still very much in what we call the genesis phase, and the computer models do not do a very good job of these developing tropical systems. Once they form, they do a fairly decent job, but in these early stages, they just don't. And the window of opportunity for development is closing, because this is drifting north, and eventually, with wherever the center ends up, should be on land sometime late tomorrow night or early on Saturday morning. So this doesn't have a whole lot of time to really get better organized, but we're going to be watching, though, and really almost regardless of where a center is, these heavier storms will likely continue moving almost due north, and that will send some of the heaviest rainfall somewhere along the central North Gulf Coast. What the Hurricane Center is saying right now, based on the center being where it is positioned now, a landfall is looking possible around Vermilion Bay sometime late Friday or early on Saturday morning. Now, if that is the case, remember, some of the heaviest rainfall will be just to the east of that center, although dry air may displace that heavier rain even farther than just to the east of the center, maybe by a 100 or so or more miles, as we have seen in some of these early season storms, to where at the moment that would put some of the heaviest rainfall over southeast Louisiana and southern Mississippi. But a lot of the models have been trending for some of that heavier rainfall, maybe a little bit even more to the east, maybe around the Mississippi-Alabama state line. Again, we're still in the early stages of the development, and so the computer models will continue to change. Let's take a look at our tropical satellite loop and see if we can really find that center of circulation just based on satellite alone. And this is the daylight imagery. Well, it is difficult to find any kind of closed circulation. And as I mentioned, hurricane hunters are currently investigating it, and they're not able to find a closed circulation. And so you see just more of what is a broad overall circulation down to the northwest of the tip of the northwestern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. So it's just kind of within this overall broad circulation that the Hurricane Center is saying the quote-unquote center of PTC-3, for lack of a better term, we'll call it now, still very much is kind of in the early stages of development. And as I mentioned, nothing as far as the impacts to us have changed. We are still expecting heavy rainfall. 6 to 10 inches wouldn't be out of the question, with some localized higher amounts, although I think seeing widespread 6 to 10 inches probably not likely. Now notice, it does cover the entire viewing area. Some of our early model runs from this afternoon have been taking what would eventually become more of a new center within all of that convection and put it right over southeast Louisiana, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because to the west of that center, it's going to be almost dry, where some areas from the river parishes, maybe home at a Baton Rouge, may not see much of anything. And then parts of southeast Louisiana would see the 1, 2, maybe 4 inches of rainfall, with the higher amounts along the Mississippi, Alabama, and even Florida coastline. Not that we wish that heavy rainfall on anyone, but certainly parts of the coast are able to withstand some of those heavier downpours, more so than southeast Louisiana. Notice this is the 3-day rainfall total. This is using various computer models, and it has been kind of hinting at some of those more bullseyes into maybe Harrison and Jackson County, Mississippi, as well as into lower Alabama, more so than southeast Louisiana, as where you go from Baton Rouge westward, you get to the purples to blue color on our scale, which is about 1 inch to maybe 1.25 inches, 1.75 inches over almost 3 days. We can more than handle that. Parts of southeast Louisiana could see 3 to 5, and that may be more likely from some of the rainfall totals and some of the models that I've been seeing just this past afternoon. Now, of course, things could change dramatically tomorrow, but this is also the European model. Don't pay too much attention to the actual totals. I'm just trying to give you an idea of Baton Rouge, 0.4 of an inch by Sunday morning. So this is looking at what rainfall we receive tomorrow, as well as some of the heaviest tomorrow night and early on Saturday. 2 to maybe 3 inches across southeast Louisiana. Again, over a 24 to 36 hour time frame, we can handle. And then some of the higher amounts as you go from Gulfport to Biloxi and even farther to the east. And that may end up being how this sets up. Coastal flooding is kind of our secondary concern, as we are under, in the areas you see highlighted in the dark green, a coastal flood warning, where we will see that water rising above high tide by about 2 to 3. And then in the unprotected areas of the lake. Now, again, these are some of the same numbers we saw a few weeks ago when we had a persistent easterly wind. So it's probably not going to be too much worse than what we saw a few weeks ago with the coastal and lakefront flooding from just a strong wind. And what we are expecting along the lakes is about 1 to 2 feet above high tide. So as I mentioned, the impacts to us have not really changed, regardless of the classification. And as a matter of fact, I want to jump back real quick just to show you the graphic from the National Hurricane Center in terms of the forecasted strengthening. They are thinking that it will become a borderline tropical storm, tropical depression. So they are going on the higher end of the forecast guidance. A lot of the forecast guidance has been maintaining at the most a tropical depression at landfall. Maybe it becomes Claudette before landfall. That's what the Hurricane Center is going with right now, but they even mentioned they are going with the higher end of the forecast guidance at the moment in terms of strength, regardless whether or not this is just Tropical Depression 3 or a named tropical storm. The impacts to us look to be about the same. The heavy rainfall and certainly some localized flooding, the coastal flooding threat as this moves onshore, as well as, and much lower, risk of some tornadoes. With the rotation of the storm within that front right quadrant, we could see a few brief, weak tornadoes spawn as the storm starts moving inland. We're going to get a little bit more depth on Facebook if you want to stay with us, but right now we'll return to programming and we'll have a much more detailed look at what is now Potential Tropical Cyclone-3 and its potential future, as well as a little bit more details on the impacts on Eyewitness News at 5 and 6. But again, if you want to stay with us, jump onto Facebook as well as YouTube, I think, for more detailed information. For now, I'm Chief Meteorologist Chris Franklin.
From Channel 4's Eyewitness News, this has been your local weather expert alert, brought to you by Egan Insurance Agency.
All right, good afternoon to all the folks joining us on Facebook Live. I just want to detail a little bit more so as to what is going on down in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'd mentioned on air that we now have a name, sort of. really the classification is still basically the same. Nothing has really changed with the storm structure or lack thereof of structure. It is still a broad surface low that the hurricane hunters are not able to find a closed circulation. So this is not an organized system by any means. It is a broad low with convection thunderstorms off on the eastern side. Still looks like it's going to be primarily a rainmaker for us as it approaches. But the reason for this new classification, this is going back just a few years, of potential tropical cyclone, means that now the National Hurricane Center can begin issuing watches and warnings. So usually in the early developmental stage of a system, when it looks almost certain that it will become a depression or a named storm, but it is nearing land and within 24 hours of actually impacting land, but not yet a named storm, it is given this classification of PTC, potential tropical cyclone. So saying it has a name is not really true, because it'll have a name if it becomes a tropical storm, or at least more of a classification if it becomes a depression. And at the moment, as I mentioned on air if you were with us, the forecast is for it to become a depression and possibly Claudette. Claudette classification, though, is still very much questionable. Hurricane Center is going with the higher end intensity guidance, which does make it a tropical storm, but a lot of the intensity guidance has it as just a depression by the time it makes landfall sometime late tomorrow night or early on Saturday. Notice, if this is indeed the center, which we may see in later analyses of satellite, and as the hurricane hunters continue to go through the center of the storm, we may see a center is more in here, which just based on satellite, and I'm going to jump over to satellite here real quick, go back to satellite. It almost looks like there's a little bit more of a broad circulation here, just looking at some of the clouds down to the south of that and then moving in that fashion. It would almost seem to me that this is where the center is. Hurricane Center is saying there, and we're going to go with that. Hurricane hunters are in the storm right now, and this is what they're saying, and that's what we're going to go with. I'm just pointing out what I see, and I see a little bit of a circulation here, and a lot of the models have been indicating that this would be the broad circulation, but a more defined center would develop within all of this convection, which is more in line with what is actually happening. Because a lot of those computer models had most of the convection almost due south of southeast Louisiana, and that center would develop here as this just moves almost due north by late tomorrow night, early on into Saturday, moving inland right over southeast Louisiana, which, as I mentioned, would not necessarily be a bad thing, because that would kind of split the difference between almost no rainfall and more of the heavier amounts, which may be a little bit more to our east. And we don't wish the heavier rain on anyone, but we can barely handle an afternoon thunderstorm in the summertime, let alone any kind of heavy tropical rainfall. So that is what we're watching right now. And the threat level to us, the impacts have not changed. Regardless of any kind of naming of this system or better organization, it still looks like it is primarily going to be a rainmaker. And then secondary to that, some coastal flooding, but all outside of the hurricane risk reduction system. Notice, though, this is not expected to stall, which also makes me think that some of the higher rainfall estimates may be a little bit too high. You tend to get those type of numbers if this were to stall or slow down once it starts moving inland, and that just does not look to be the case. This is going to follow an eventual weakness in the subtropical ridge and continue moving fairly quickly up toward the northeast, which is also a great direction for us, because remember, at these points, the heaviest rainfall is off to the east. So at this point making landfall, some of the heaviest rainfall may be over southeast Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. And then at this point into the midday hours of Saturday, the heaviest of the rainfall may be gone. And so this may be more of a late tomorrow night, early Saturday before the daybreak hours. And then by the midday and into the afternoon on Saturday, we're already starting to improve. And this does not look to be an all-weekend event, certainly. I'm hoping to at least get somewhat of a Father's Day on Sunday. And it looks like by that point, at least the storm will be gone. Might have some lingering showers and thunderstorms on Sunday, but at least our tropical worries will be long gone, as it looks like the center of that may get out into the Atlantic. And after that, Not really our problem, but maybe something that the Canadian Maritimes have to watch. I'm looking at tropical satellite here, and for the 5 o'clock newscast, I'm going to go to our high-resolution satellite just to get actually a minute-by-minute picture of the circulation of whatever is trying to form here. And just again to point out, Hurricane Hunter or Hurricane Center thinks that the center is right about there. And again, I don't want to disagree with them. I just want to show you what I'm seeing at the moment. And they're saying it's down south. At least based on the visible satellite, looks like there's more of a circulation here, at least based on satellite, more of a reason to put the center about here. And again, as I mentioned, we'll kind of see how this evolves through the day and into tomorrow, but a lot of the models had been indicating, and perhaps correctly so, we would have this broad circulation here, the convection developing off to the more northeast of that broad circulation, and within this convection, we get a more defined center, which would be, and I know you can't see it on our map here, would be just to the south of the southeast Louisiana coastline. And so it may be that, and again, we'll see how this progresses, that this may be where a center finally becomes more established as it begins moving up toward the north. Impacts to us, though, will not change. Heavy rainfall threat, 6 to 10 inches with some localized amounts, certainly possible. I think going on the higher end of that scale would be more likely if this were going to be a very slow-moving system. It does not look like that is really going to be a threat. And the models have been indicating, again, you had the Hurricane Center saying that it was going to be maybe more around the Vermilion Bay area, which if that's the case, it could potentially put some of the heavier rainfall right over southeast Louisiana. But the trend from the models has been painting in some of those more bullseye amounts over coastal Mississippi and Alabama. And again, not wishing that on anyone, especially as we have viewers in southern Mississippi and even some folks that will watch us online in Alabama. You at least have a little bit more terrain to deal with, whereas in southeast Louisiana, we just don't have that luxury. And so some of the totals that we could see around us may be more along the lines of 3 to 5. I could easily see us maybe through tomorrow and into Saturday accumulating 3 to 5, maybe more widespread. Those higher amounts may be far more localized in nature. And then as you get from the river parishes out toward Baton Rouge, it's more of the 1 to maybe 2 inches of rainfall that we see from this event. Again, there's going to be probably a pretty tight gradient on those rainfall totals with next to nothing out to the west of the center, and then you get some of those heavier 5+ inches of rain as you get toward the Mississippi and Alabama coastline. As I mentioned, secondary in nature for threats is the coastal flooding concern. 2 to 3 feet expected above high tide, and generally speaking over the next couple of days, high tide will be in the late morning, midday to afternoon hours, so that's when the water is going to be at the highest points Friday and into Saturday, and then luckily as the storm trajectory takes it to the northeast, the water levels should begin to drop. In the lake, about 1 to 2. These are very similar heights as what we saw a few weeks ago when we had those strong, sustained easterly winds. Here's what's going on water vapor, and there is a lot, actually. Very dry air over us. Unrelated to the tropics, it actually feels nice outside, huh? The dew points are a little bit lower. They're in the 50s and 60s for mid-June. Not bad. If we didn't have this to deal with, that would be the big story. So we're 90 degrees right now, but there's no heat index because the humidity is so low. But there is drier air, not really dry, but definitely some dry air kind of getting mixed into that broad circulation, which is also an upper level low. That doesn't really bode well for a developing tropical system. You saw that circulation on satellite, but then in the upper parts of the atmosphere, that circulation is still there. So this is really more of not a surface-based low, but a mid and upper level low, which means the environment for this to just rapidly intensify is not there. You have dry air, you have wind shear across the Gulf of Mexico, all of which will keep this as a very weak system. And notice what our computer model does with the dry air and moisture is kind of keeps that center cut off from the main moisture. So that's going to be key wherever this does eventually make landfall, because right at the center, now this has it kind of with the center here. Notice this model also going with more of that main rotation moving right over southeast Louisiana, you may get this little bulge of moisture, but also if that drier air is able to wrap around enough, you might have the center of the storm almost completely rain-free and some of the heavier amounts from Alabama toward the Florida Panhandle, and that may be the case. We have seen this numerous times when dry air gets entrained into the center of that storm. It really is able to displace some of the heaviest rainfall, and that may certainly be the case with number 3, Claudette, if it becomes Claudette. Here's another one of our tropical models, bringing in the heavy rainfall again late tomorrow night, early Saturday, and then during the day Saturday, most of that rainfall is gone. Here's our high resolution model starting early tomorrow morning. Now, this model is pretty aggressive, that already by 9 a.m. we have some very heavy rain right off of the coastline. We'll see. But then that heavy rainfall moves in throughout the day, and there are, notice, some breaks in the rain, so it may not just be a constant rain, which would also be great for flooding risk. And then as we get into late Friday night, here comes some of the heaviest rainfall into early Saturday, the overnight hours of Saturday into early morning hours. Then by daybreak, a lot of that rain may be moving out with drier weather coming in for the rest of the day on Saturday. So at the moment, I just kind of like to look at what is happening. What are the models thinking? Are they initializing well? And the models are initializing well. I'm not in complete agreement. I don't want to contradict what the Hurricane Center is saying, but I'm not in complete agreement that that would be the position I would go with for the center of circulation. Really, I almost think it's too soon to declare a center of circulation, which is one reason why I don't really like showing a center when it's still just an invest area, because there really is no center. If it's just an area of investigation, then it's more or less just a broad rotation. There is no closed circulation until it becomes a depression or a storm, which is why I usually don't like showing that low icon when it's just an invest, because there is no real center until the storm becomes more of a developed system. But most of our models have been hinting at more of a late night in terms of timing, late night tomorrow into early Saturday, and then more or less improving conditions throughout the day Saturday and going into Sunday, Father's Day. Now, there is a risk, as I mentioned, probably on our tier of 3 level risks and threats would be the rain, and then the coastal flooding, and then perhaps a few brief, weak tornadoes. Just with a landfalling tropical system, that overall broad rotation, it's easily to get a little spinning thunderstorm that can spawn again, short-lived tornado. Usually they start out as water spouts and then move inland, and that may be kind of our 3rd risk level from the storm itself. Winds are going to start picking up during the day tomorrow, and then as it gets closer, depending on its strength, we could see easily tropical storm force winds as we get into late Friday afternoon and evening. Winds are going to stay up through the night on Friday going into Saturday, but as I mentioned, based on the trajectory of the storm during the day Friday, as the center moves inland and then across us, we will begin to see more of a northwesterly wind, which will begin pushing that water out of the area. So what do we know? What do we expect? The system is certainly trying to organize. We're beginning to see more thunderstorms developing, not necessarily around that broad circulation, but I think that is coming. It is still primarily going to be a rain maker as we go into late tomorrow and into Saturday. Heaviest of the rain will be east of the center, wherever that center ends up being. And it may be that the heaviest of the rain is well displaced from that center. If drier air is able to rotate around the center, it could be almost rain-free, and the heaviest of the rainfall is 100+ miles off to the east. So it is certainly going to be on the eastern side of the center. Just how far to the east is yet to be seen. We'll have to wait and see if that dry air is really able to make much of an impact. So recapping this for folks on Facebook at the moment, we have Potential Tropical Cyclone-3. Not still yet a name storm. It's kind of in that limbo phase right now. But we do now have a tropical storm warning up from Intracoastal City along the Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama coast all the way to the Alabama-Florida state line, which means those are the areas that within 24 hours we'll begin to see tropical storm force conditions. The rain and the winds and the potential coastal flooding. Rain is going to be our main threat. Probably some of the heaviest will be late Friday and into Saturday, and then likely improving conditions. Not that we're going to be dry, but improving conditions as we go throughout the rest of the day Saturday and into Sunday. If this is the only tropical system we have to deal with this year, this is one that would be just fine. I know at this point a lot of folks are probably just tired of talking about it. I know we are. It was an invest for so long, but what was really interesting about this is that I'm looking back at some of my forecast discussions from last Monday, June 8th. We were talking about models hinting at some potential development in the Bay of Campeche or western Gulf of Mexico, and sure enough, it is developing. So the model verification on this is pretty good. They're not always that good, but this one has been fairly well forecasted, and if it verifies through tomorrow night and into early Saturday, then we should be okay. Again, it's just going to be a heavy rain event. We were dry today, and it actually felt pretty nice. What can you do to prepare? Just make sure that you have any of your storm drains out front, that they are clear. We're going to get some heavy rainfall, and we know it doesn't take much to flood, so as long as we have somewhere for that water to go, I think we will be okay. Again, we're going to dive into this a little bit more and perhaps have a depression before later tonight or certainly by tomorrow morning, but we're going to detail all of this coming up on Eyewitness News at 5 and 6. I've talked enough for now. I'll see you at 5. I'm Chief Meteorologist Chris Franklin.